All right, everybody, welcome back to our second session. We got the mic testing, hopefully all done there, thank you. So next up, we have Dr. Douglas Gates. He's an acupuncturist. If we could get the noise down, please. He carries a lot up here. So, Douglas, friend and colleague from Portland, Oregon, one of the pioneers right now going on in Oregon psilocybin services. He's an acupuncturist, herbalist, and among the first licensed psilocybin facilitators in the United States, specializing in neurological, emotional, and neurocognitive conditions, as well as acute and chronic pain. He also just recently opened up Seven Gate Sanctuary, one of the first licensed Oregon psilocybin service centers. Beautiful location if you ever have a chance to check it out. It's really an awesome place. Everything goes well with that. So he has written 8 books. So in here we can have it incorrect, not 4, but 8 books on topics of brain health and consciousness, including circuits and Shen. He received his doctorate from 5 Branches University and master's in acupuncture and oriental medicine from the Oregon College of Oriental Medicine, with postgraduate studies in clinical neuroscience from the Carrick Institute. So welcome, Doug. Thank you.
And I'll start by thanking James as well for some great broad strokes with that first talk. It sort of laid some foundation of what we're going to get into, and there was some really good stuff covered. So thank you for that. We're going to kind of zoom in on a couple of the things that were mentioned. So I've been brought in to talk about the neuroscience of psychedelics, and we're going to talk about microdosing and get into sort of some of the details about that, how that all works. So let's go ahead and start with some of the neuroscience type stuff. As mentioned in the first talk, there are multiple categories of psychedelics. We're going to take a look at most of the major ones that are being looked at in a research or in a therapeutic capacity for the most part. So the 4 broad categories that those tend to fall into are your classic psychedelics. These are going to be psilocybin, LSD, mescaline, DMT. And then there's a category called empathogens or entactogens. This is what MDMA tends to fall under. There's dissociatives, ketamine tends to fall into this. And then there's ibogaine, which is a sort of a beast into its own. It's cholinergic, and we'll get into the details of what each one of these means and how it influences the personal experience at more of a neurobiological level. So with the classic psychedelics, these are also referred to as serotonergics. The reason for that is they impact and work on the serotonin receptors. We'll get into exactly what receptor in just a little bit. But I'd like to start off with this slide when taking into consideration when we start talking about serotonin. Serotonin is a major neurotransmitter in the body that regulates a lot of different functions, including mood, sleep regulation, and a number of other things. Something to keep in mind is that the vast majority of serotonin that's produced naturally in the body is about 90% of that is produced in the GI tract. It's produced in the gut. So it's just important to keep in mind as we kind of sit with this. But I add all of this biochemistry because the top left one there is what serotonin looks like. That's a serotonin molecule. And if you look just to the right here, we have a psilocybin molecule. And then just to the right of that, we have psilocin. And psilocin is what psilocybin breaks down into what it gets metabolized as. So when somebody ingests psilocybin, the body breaks it down into the compound psilocin. And if you take a look and compare serotonin to both psilocybin and psilocin, but particularly psilocin, they're very, very similar in their chemical structures. The other serotonergics I also have in here, and you can see that there are also similarities, not quite as much, but DMT, mescaline, LSD, all have fairly similar chemical structures. Just broadly in terms of serotonin, in the central nervous system, most of the serotonin that's produced in the brain is done so in a portion of the brainstem or midbrain called the raphe nuclei. And so it's all produced from there and then moved out throughout the rest of the brain tissue. With other neurotransmitters, sometimes they'll activate just particular regions of the brain, but in this case, serotonin tends to go fairly systemic, hit a lot of the bulk of the brain. So, yeah. Turn up the volume. Yeah, I can also try to move this a little bit closer. I don't know if that'll help. Is that any better, or do we still need to bring it up? That's okay? All right, so again, I love to bring this up just so that you're able to compare and see the similarities in chemical structure and really how these serotonergics are activating or how they're fitting into the receptors that James had mentioned. So there is a difference. Psychedelics, the classic psychedelics, stimulate a particular receptor of serotonin. It's a serotonin 2A receptor. This is different from the mechanism through which antidepressants or SSRIs or SNRIs work. So the serotonin receptor that those work on and stimulate the SSRIs is the serotonin 1A receptor. So if you are taking a look at this, anytime that you see 5-HT, that just means serotonin. So 5-HT2A receptor just means serotonin 2 receptor. But if you take a look at this, there are stark differences in the influence that stimulating the different receptors have, but in particular when it comes to therapeutic mechanism or how it's influencing somebody when you're taking a look at especially research that's being done in the realm of classical psychedelics for depression. And so a lot of the stark differences being that your SSRIs tend to have sort of an emotional blunting effect overall. So if you sit down and talk with a number of people who have or are taking SSRIs for their depression, a lot of them will report that they may feel less depressed, but they also feel less emotionally overall, which just kind of dampens everything. And then that's not so with psychedelics. So with psychedelics, the tendency is that it allows for somebody to have more, the term that's being used more and more is psychological flexibility. It's allowing somebody to actually sit with or work through the emotions that are coming up, as opposed to just blunting them and not making them accessible. So that's sort of the difference that the two receptor stimulations make, the difference between psychedelics and some of the effects of SSRIs, particularly as it relates to depression. There was a brief mention of neurogenesis or neuroplasticity, and I want to touch on this just a little bit. If you're going to be around all week and you hear either my talk tomorrow or Saturday, we'll get into how this applies in different realms. Tomorrow we'll be talking about the psycho-emotional component and working with that, and then Saturday we'll be talking about how it may work on more of a physical rehabilitation component. But generally speaking, psychedelics have shown to increase neuroplasticity, plasticity being the ability to create change or being plastic. And neurogenesis is the generation of new neurons or new neural connections. So at the neuroscience level, this is where a lot of the research is being done and is being emphasized because they're seeing such stark changes as a result of psychedelic ingestion. So it's shown increases in spinogenesis, new neural connections, and new synapse generation as well under the influence or as a result of psychedelics. There's a term psychoplastogen that's been put out, and there are a number of papers that take a look at this and use this label. If you talk to Gold Dolan, who I'll be referencing a fair amount this weekend in the other talks, she's not a big fan of this term, and we'll kind of talk about why. But psychoplastogens as a whole, the term is derived from three Greek components, psyche meaning psyche or mind, plast being that ability to change or be malleable or initiate change, and then gen being able to generate. So they're substances that have been shown to generate the ability to have plasticity in the mind. Most of the psychedelics that we're going to talk about today all fall into this category. So, in order to qualify as a psychoplastogen, it has to have a couple different qualities. It has to be something that induces neuroplasticity relatively quick after administration or after a single dose. So that's within 24 to 36 hours or so. There's a huge spike in neuroplasticity, or as I'll talk in my other talks, sort of an opening of critical plasticity or critical windows in which malleability and the opportunity to initiate change can take place. The other qualifier for a psychoplastogen is that the duration of that window, or the duration of that plasticity, extends far beyond just the administration period or the altered state that somebody has under the influence of a psychedelic. So that varies from substance to substance, and it tends to be correlated with the duration of the journey itself. So with substances like ketamine, it's a relatively short duration, and the critical window of plasticity is relatively shorter. So I think I mentioned it in the ketamine slide, but ketamine you're usually looking at about a 2-week window, psilocybin or MDMA usually about a 3-week window, and ibogaine is usually longer than that, 4 or 5 weeks or so. It doesn't come without risk, and we'll get into that. But as far as the way that Dolan takes a look at this, and it's worth mentioning, is the difference between metaplasticity and hyperplasticity. And this is distinguishing the difference to sort of delineate, as opposed to using the very broad term neuroplasticity or psychoplastogen. Metaplasticity refers to being meta, so it's a plasticity of plasticity, or it's the ability or how effective something is at inducing plasticity. And so I talk about this a lot when I'm teaching about rehab, because it's very important. There are a lot of components that can play into how somebody responds to a particular therapy, and that can be anything from substances ingested to the time of day, to their mood, to other things that they may be doing. So sometimes we'll couple certain activities with the therapy, and it makes a difference on how well somebody responds. The same thing comes into play here. So metaplasticity refers to how effective something is, how effective an intervention is at inducing plasticity, as opposed to hyperplasticity, which is a broader term. It just means that there's a lot of plasticity happening, and it's happening very rapidly. The differentiation that's made here in terms of psychedelics is that psychedelics tend to fall into metaplasticity. There are a number of substances that also induce really high rates of neuroplasticity, but they have potential detriment, and they can have addictive qualities. So things like cocaine will induce hyperplasticity, but it's highly addictive and it's problematic, and it's an issue. Whereas that doesn't come into play with psychedelics. So there's been this delineation of the term metaplasticity to focus on psychedelics as opposed to broader hyperplasticity. Critical periods I already sort of talked on. That's a particular period of time in which this neuroplasticity or metaplasticity becomes available. Like I said, if you sit down on either of my talks this weekend, we'll get into that a lot more. Also relatively new in trying to find underlying commonality between the psychedelics, because like I said at the beginning, the classical psychedelics work on the serotonin receptors, and as we'll see, other psychedelics work on other receptors in different ways. There's recent research taking a look at an underlying commonality, maybe the ability to initiate change at the level of the extracellular matrix in the cells of the body. So I don't want to get into that too much because of time. But I have everything referenced here if anybody really wants to dig into this material and stuff. Everything is referenced, so you can look at all of that up. How many of you have seen this before? Okay, a few of you. If you start looking into psychedelic research or listening to talks or anything like that, probably several times this weekend, you'll run into this diagram. And what this is depicting is, this is a mapping of neural connections or communication between So the diagram on your left is the brain as it normally is, not under the influence of psychedelics. The image on the right is the brain communication that's happening under the influence of psychedelics. So what you can clearly see is there's a lot more lines happening. The size of the circles around the outside, each circle is a brain region. So those neural connections are between those brain regions. And you'll see some of those circles are larger, which means they're more active as well. So what they're finding in the neuroscience is that macro doses, larger doses of psychedelics, tend to create an increase in more global communication within the brain. It's allowing more areas of the brain to communicate amongst themselves, and it's strengthening the communication overall. There are a couple of things that we'll touch on where communication is just altered. It's not necessarily enhanced. There's a decoupling between certain areas that has a particular influence, but when you look at it, yes, absolutely. But when you look at it on more of a global scale, you're seeing this increased communication throughout the brain. And that sort of brings us to that the top part here. There's a particular decoupling that's found between two areas of the brain, the default mode network. Has anybody heard or familiar with the influence of the default mode network of psychedelics? So the default mode network in the brain is a network of areas that communicate and function together, and it's associated with the experience of introspection or dreaming or kind of going inward. And it's also tends to have a correlation with what we consider the ego or the sense of self. And so this decoupling that happens under the influence of psychedelics between the frontal lobe and the default mode network has been attributed to the transpersonal experience of ego death or ego loss. So they're taking a look at the neurological mechanisms that tend to correlate with that. And then the diagram that I have here, there's also a term called canalization in terms of our thinking patterns and how we tend to go about our daily routine and how we tend to work through things mentally. Is that we sort of develop or create these canals or these bridges of neural communication as we do things over and over again. We have these thought patterns that tend to repeat themselves or that we go back to. And what they're finding is that when you do this over and over again, it makes the communication more efficient. So the more times that you do it, the easier it is for your brain to do it. And so it becomes more difficult to sort of break out of that pattern and realize the association with trauma and working through traumatic experiences and things like that, or just origin thought patterns that we tend to get. And what the diagram here is showing, this is in relation to, again, looking at depression, but the idea that depressed feelings or these negative thoughts that can come with depression create these sort of canals or these bridges of neural communication that become much more efficient over time, and we get kind of stuck in them. We get stuck in these loops. And psilocybin has been shown, or at least the metaphor is that it sort of stretches out or flattens out that landscape. Another way to think of it is if you ski or snowboard, you're up on the mountain and there are developed pathways over time because people have gone over them over and over again. But when you get a fresh patch of snow, you have the ability to create new pathways and kind of go wherever you want. You can branch out from there. And the same sort of thing seems to apply to psychedelics in terms of thinking and brain patterns and thinking patterns. There's also an area in the brain called the colostrum that's being taken a look at in terms of the influence that psychedelics may have. The colostrum can be thought of as like the conductor in the brain, which is sort of a switchboard in which a lot of information comes in and then it divvies out that information, kind of tells the rest of the brain or the body what to do from there. And so what they're finding is that psychedelics tend to influence this colostrum area, and this may have to do with some of the influences on both the default network and the ability to initiate change or allow for some of this psychological flexibility that comes on as a result. There's also various influences in terms of cognitive neuroscience in the realm of cognitive neuroscience and how psychedelics may help with that, or how it may influence that. So it sort of creates a meta-control framework, as well as a number of other influences. I want to be mindful of time. But this is a diagram of various receptor sites, and we're not going to go into all of this, but this is basically just showing that different substances, different psychedelics have an influence on different receptors and sort of what that looks like at a biochemical level. Okay, we'll go ahead and take a look at some of the non-classic psychedelics. So shifting away from the serotonergics, we'll start with MDMA. MDMA does influence the serotonin receptors, and as was mentioned, it is an MAOI, so an MAO inhibitor, and because of that, it can create too much serotonin in the synapse. So you can run the risk of serotonin syndrome. This isn't really an issue with classic psychedelics because they don't have MAOIs. But when it comes to MDMA, ayahuasca, this is something to be very cautious about, especially if somebody is already taking or has been taking SSRIs or SNRIs. But there's a great quote that I like to include when it comes to MDMA. Quite simply, MDMA opens the heart. The influence at a neurochemical level that MDMA has is not only serotonin, but also influences norepinephrine receptors, and to a degree, dopamine receptors as well, but it's primarily norepinephrine and serotonin. And that combination, the norepinephrine gives it that an elevating energized component. It does stimulate hormone production, so oxytocin, vasopressin, and prolactin. These are all chemicals or components that have a lot to do with bonding. And so when it comes to MDMA and sort of opening up the ability to create or allow for greater connection among individuals. So this is where that bonding or connecting component comes into play, which is why it can be very useful in trauma work and feeling connected with, in a therapeutic environment, feeling connected or safe or bonded to an extent with your facilitator, so that as you approach or as you're working through difficult things or past traumas and things like that, you create a safe or positive association with the environment in which you're speaking, or in which you're experiencing it, and can allow for greater fear extinction. So that means that it allows you to work through those things and actually eliminate the tendency to associate fear or negative feelings with these things as you're thinking about them or as you're working through them. Okay, ketamine is a dissociative. It's the only one that we're going to talk about that's a Schedule 3 drug. Everything else is Schedule 1. That means it's the only one that's available to be prescribed, and thus is much more readily available, and so now it's being used within therapeutic settings. You can even have it prescribed to you and sent to your home so that you can self-administer as well. It doesn't come without its risk, so it works on the opioid receptors, which means it does have an addiction risk. So that's very important to be aware of when it comes to ketamine. It works on the NMDA receptors, but really what it comes down to is that opioid component. It's primary as well as dopamine, the muscarinic receptors, and to an extent the nicotine and acetylcholine receptors. Some people report an experience sort of like a near-death experience or an out-of-body experience with it. It's the dissociative properties. There are neuroscience or neurobiological correlates to that they're finding, so there's some really interesting research that they're doing related to the temporal parietal occipital junction of the brain, which is kind of this area right in here, and being able to induce those sorts of experiences without psychedelics. So you can use a small magnet, or not a small magnet, a large or strong magnet rather, over that area of the brain, and it'll actually activate it, and people will also report having something similar to a near-death or an out-of-body experience. So that's kind of the tie-in there that they're taking a look at the neuroscience level. And we already kind of talked about the shorter neuroplastic effects related to ketamine. So the neuroplasticity or metaplasticity does increase, but in comparison to your serotonergics or MDMA or ibogaine, it is a shorter duration. And so when you're taking into account integration or additional interventions to sort of maximize that neuroplasticity, to be aware that that would have a significantly shorter with ketamine. And then ibogaine is a rather unique psychedelic, if you want to lump it into that category. It's what's called an onerogenic. This is the ability to induce a dreamlike state, or a state akin to REM sleep while you're awake. So if you want to think about it in as sort of the dream time state that's been reported by a lot of indigenous cultures, or a number of indigenous cultures, draw a correlation there. What some people report with ibogaine, ibogaine doesn't mess around. It's a very long experience. It can be 24, 36 hours of a psychedelic experience. So it's very intense, and it also comes with significant risk. So it has cardiovascular effects, or risk of cardiovascular toxicity. And so there have been deaths related to ibogaine ingestion and ibogaine journeys. So anytime that this is being administered in the places where it is available, it's usually done with very close monitoring. At least if you're going, there are a number of places related to opioid withdrawal and opioid addiction, and working with that and treating that with ibogaine. And it looks very, very promising. People who've been addicted to opioids for years have this very long experience, this long psychedelic experience, come out of it and report that they don't have the cravings anymore, or that they don't have an issue with the opioids anymore. So it's at a tough place with ibogaine right now, because it's showing a lot of potential promise, but it doesn't come without risk. There was a really interesting study that was just released this last year, I think, where they took a look at ibogaine and treating veterans with TBI, traumatic brain injury, which is something that I work with a lot clinically. And they coupled it with magnesium, and they reported that that might be a safer way to go about that. So that's something that's still in its infancy, but it is being explored in terms of reducing that cardiac risk. But ibogaine is definitely one all on its own in terms of length of the experience, some of the potential risks, as I mentioned with the neuroplasticity, the length of neuroplasticity, because theoretically, hypothetically at this point, because the psychedelic experience is significantly longer, that window of neuroplasticity, or that critical window, has been shown to be open longer or available longer. So the research is backing up that it's longer. It's just the hypothetical is that tie-in with the duration of the journey itself.